Welcome to the latest edition of Dynamic Political Centrism, hosted by Alan Steinberg, produced by Dr. Jonathan Yoni Yaris. Our guest, Jack Gilden, author of Collision of Wills, Johnny Unitas, Don Shula, and the Rise of the Modern NFL.
Good evening and welcome to the podcast of myself, Alan Steinberg, the voice of Dynamic Political Centrism, produced by the one, the only Dr. Jonathan Yaris. And I have been thrilled, as has Yoni, by the increasing attendance on this podcast. You, the listeners, have made it possible, and I thank all of you. But tonight we have a special treat for you. In a lot of ways, this will be the most enjoyable podcast I've ever done. As you know, I am a political junkie. I practice politics 24 hours a day, and it is a very engrossing, it's been my vocation. It is now in retirement, my avocation. But I also have a love of sports. And right now, as we are on the eve of the Super Bowl, I thought it was very important that we do a show on the Super Bowl, not just talking about the X's and O's on the field, but talking about the real influence that sports has on society. Our guest tonight, Jack Gilden, has written the finest book on the history. Can everyone see it? All right, I'll try to step back a bit. This was a book, I believe it is the finest book ever written about pro football. And it's entitled Collision of Wills, Johnny Unitas, Don Shula, and the Rise of the Modern NFL. Now, this book is the finest book I've ever read on the history of the National Football League and on the game itself. There's another book I love. It's a book by Roger Kahn, which is very famous. The book is called The Boys of Summer, all about my all-time favorite sports team, the Brooklyn Dodgers. So and I got to meet Roger Kahn during my lifetime, and it was a real pleasure. He was impressed by my knowledge of Brooklyn Dodger trivia. So to have Jack Gilden on is an honor. And Jack, welcome to our show.
Thanks, Alan. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Now, Jack, I want to make an observation that there is something in common about the Boys of Summer and Collision of Wills. I remember the Brooklyn Dodger fans. That's what made me a Brooklyn Dodger fan. I remember a particular game I watched in 1956, the last weekend of the season. The Dodgers were up by the Braves, the Milwaukee Braves, no longer in Milwaukee, because teams play the game of musical chairs. But the Brooklyn Dodgers were behind the Milwaukee Braves by one game, and Milwaukee lost on Friday night. On Saturday, the Dodgers won a doubleheader over the Pittsburgh Pirates. I happened to see the games. That put them one up because Milwaukee lost the game to the St. Louis Cardinals, who had a rather nondescript pitcher by the name of Herman Waymeyer, who pitched the greatest game of his life that day. And then the next day, the Dodgers clinched the pennant. But those Dodger fans were great. But the greatest pro football fans I saw in these early years of development of the NFL were the Baltimore Colt fans. And to me, it is a tragedy. I know now Baltimore has the Baltimore Ravens. And I guess, I'd ask you how much the fans have gotten used to the switch between being Colt fans and Raven fans. But I'm sorry, I'm looking at it as an outsider. They may be very great Baltimore Raven fans, but there was nothing like those Colt fans.
No, I mean the Colts were everything to this city. We didn't really have big time college teams here in the town, and we weren't a big cosmopolitan city like New York or Washington D.C. And so we lavished all our affection on the Colts. That was the team. I would say, as far as whether or not they've forgotten about them here, it depends on how old you are. So many of the fans that populate the stadium today who are adults, they weren't even alive or they were babies when the Colts left town. I was an adult already when the Colts left, and had inherited the love for that team from all the men I admired, when I was growing up. We loved the Colts, and one of the very last versions of them, I played high school football right next to their training site, and after practice on Fridays, they would come over and watch our football games. So I was a big Colts fan.
Well, I want to tell you something. I will never forget the sudden death game. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but that sudden death game at Yankee Stadium, December 1958, I watch with my dad. It brings a great feeling back because I, I get a little emotional about this. Watching sport events with my father was one of the great pleasures of my life. And I think every son feels that way who has the
I
pleasure
do
of
too.
you know exactly what it is like.
Yeah.
And I will never forget sitting there watching with my dad, and he explained the meaning of sudden death. You know, and thankfully it wasn't literal.
Right.
But the thing that I won't forget is New York City had a newspaper strike then, and all these fans came up with from Baltimore. There was an absolute multitude of Baltimore Colt fans at Yankee Stadium that day, and they were the greatest fans in the world. They got the Baltimore Colt fight song. I know now it's the Ravens fight song.
Yeah.
I go to my YouTube all the time to listen to Johnny Unitas, John Constantine Unitas, give the introduction to that Baltimore Colt fight song. And Jack, I'm sorry, that'll never leave me.
No, I mean it was a great song. It was great enthusiasm for that team. And if you think about it, Baltimore really didn't have big time professional sports since the 19th century. It was
Correct.
the Orioles with John McGraw and Wee Willie Keeler and these great teams that were considered the greatest baseball team of all time until the 27 Yankees really came and dethroned them from that title. But Baltimore hadn't, that was a great team and Baltimore clung to it, but they didn't really have another great big league team again until the Colts came around in the 1950s. So it was from the 1890s to the 1950s that they had a
Exactly.
great big league team again.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. The Baltimore Orioles then didn't they move to New York and became the New York Highlanders, who then became the Yankees?
That's correct. So what happened was there was the National League Orioles, which are the famous Orioles that we were just talking about.
Ned Hamlin.
That great team. And then that team was merged with the Brooklyn Dodgers in kind of a
Right.
scam. So what had happened was the owners wanted to create a cartel, and one ownership group would own all of the big league teams. And so as part of this scam, they had decided to dissolve the Orioles that were filled with all of these stars and bring all these great stars to Brooklyn instead, bring them to New York City, where it would do the ownership group much better. So that's what they did. So Ban Johnson, who was just forming the American League then out of a National League, he saw the possibilities in it, and he made an American League Baltimore Orioles that played there for only 1 or 2 seasons. John McGraw was the manager, and I think he may have had a minor ownership stake in those Orioles. And he and Ban Johnson detested each other. So Ban Johnson wanted to get rid of him. He wanted to get rid of Ban Johnson. But first, he was sat in the clubhouse of the stadium overnight with a shotgun in his hands, refused to go to sleep because he knew that the movers were going to come and take all the equipment and uniforms away. So eventually he knew he had to give in. So he did, and he took the job and an ownership stake in the New York Giants at that time, which of course he famously stayed there for decades, became the greatest manager in the history of baseball. And the American League Orioles, as you recall, they went to Manhattan first, where they played at the Polo Grounds. I think
Right.
they were the Highlanders, and then they became the New York Yankees 1 or 2 seasons later.
Well, you just really touched my heart with something. The thing that hurt me in 1984 was Robert Ursay. Excuse my mentioning his name. Okay, when they moved the Colts out, they sneaked out of town. And you
Yeah,
mentioned how they were, the Orioles and the Highlanders. They were trying to get the uniforms and equipment out. This
yeah,
really was repulsive. They got on a Mayflower truck, I think it was,
yes, it was.
a Mayflower truck, and they took all of that stuff, even Buddy Young's shoes. That stunk to high heaven. Buddy Young, for our listeners, Jack remembers him well. He
Yeah,
was, I think, 5'4". I think that was something like that. And
yeah.
you would return kickoffs for the Colts. Everyone loved Buddy Young, and they even took his shoes. Those lousy bums. The
He was
Ursay
super
family.
fast, Buddy Young. He had him race a horse and he beat it. And he was a great ball player. But yeah, they took everything. In fact, I lived right near their training site, that they left from, that you saw on those cameras on that snowy
I
night in
remember.
March. I lived right next to it, and in fact, to this very day, I have a job in Owings Mills, and passed by that training site every day. It's now a part of Stevenson University, but I can never go past it without thinking about the Colts and thinking about that snowy night in March. It's something I never got over. Just, like losing a member of the family, a dear member of
100%.
the family.
And Jack, this is something you and I have in common. You grew up in Baltimore. I grew up in Pittsburgh. And both of these places are in sports history, but they're both wonderful cities that are sort of the Rodney Dangerfields of America. Neither city gets the respect that it deserves. These are basically old industrial towns, but great cultural places. The city of Pittsburgh has Carnegie Mellon University. It has the University of Pittsburgh. It's where the Jonas Salk developed the Salk vaccine. And it also has wonderful opera. Same thing with Baltimore, with all the music it has.
And the
Uh,
history.
and it doesn't get the respect. So there was something about that 71 World Series with the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Baltimore Orioles. I said to myself, I'm glad to see two towns like this in the spotlight. It's well deserved. I remember that World Series of 71 and 79. Earl Weaver, who was a great manager, he must have hated the Pittsburgh Pirates after
No,
both
I'm
those
sure he
World
did.
Series.
Well,
Earl
there
the
were so
Pearl.
many good ball players on the Pittsburgh franchise in those days. And let me just say about the city of Pittsburgh, of course, being their bitter enemies in football, I hate the Steelers, of
I
course.
understand.
But the city of Pittsburgh itself, I couldn't love more. I don't think there's two cities in America that I love better than Pittsburgh. It's the most gorgeous city for people who've never been there. It's it's got the natural beauty of the three rivers. It's got the mountains. It's got the man-made beauty of the bridges and the engineering marvels and the architectural marvels of that city. And the people are just the kindest, most passionate people. It's a wonderful, wonderful city. I've always loved the city. I've always loved the people, and it's very fun to be living in a city that's their primary rival. Because everybody takes it so seriously, and it's heartbreaking to lose to the Steelers at any given time.
I remember there was a plane that crashed into the second deck
Yeah,
at Memorial
right
Stadium,
between the uprights.
right between the uprights. And I think that was in the playoffs of 1976.
Yeah,
It
it
crashed
was.
right up there.
Which
And that,
fortunately, they said that, the Steelers blew out the Colts in that game.
I
And it was
remember.
one of the most fortunate things that ever happened because the fans left early because the Colts were losing so badly, didn't have a chance to win. And if had they stayed, had it been a close game, or if the Colts had won it, many people would have been killed by that plane crash.
That was a fortunate disaster that the fans had to leave. That would have been
Yeah,
just
it was.
that would have been horrific. But I have great memories of Baltimore too, and then I'll get into the football. Uh, I One of my closest friends in the world, Avi Albrecht, is one of the greatest baritone cantors, Chazanim, in the world. And I spent a lot of time at his house in Pikesville, Maryland.
Hmm.
The synagogue there, Beit Tefillah, it was as big as Three River Stadium. I used to get lost walking around inside.
Which synagogue was he with? Do you remember?
Bet Tefillah, it was called.
Oh, Beth Philly, yes.
Yes, and he's just a marvelous cantor. I mean, he has sung opera also in concerts. He's just a marvelous. But he had great years in Baltimore. He still lives there. He's retired and he still lives there.
Yeah.
And Baltimore had just one of the greatest Jewish communities in the world.
Yeah.
With Ner Yisrael, the Orthodox institution of education, and Pittsburgh also had a great Jewish community. Still does in Squirrel Hill, and our cities deserve respect. And
Yeah.
I think it's odd they finally got some of this respect in the world of sports. The
Yeah,
71
I
series,
agree.
and it was very very interesting. But
Well, especially in the National Football League, where those two franchises. I mean, in Baltimore, between the Colts and the Ravens, I think they had far more players on the all-time, list, on the 100-year anniversary list than any other city. And Pittsburgh dominated that list as well. They were high on it too, but they're probably second on the list. There's so many great Steelers on there.
Oh, absolutely. I can go all the way back. It shows you how sports memories never leave. I was at my aunt's home on vacation in 1961. I was 11 years old, going on 12. And I read the paper one morning, and it talks about the big trade the Steelers and the Colts made. That's when the Steelers got Big Daddy Lipscomb.
Oh
Now,
yeah,
I
and
want
the
to I want
Colts
to say
got Jimmy Orr.
Jimmy Orr. That's right. It was a good trade for both teams, except poor Big Daddy had a lot of emotional problems that led to his horrible
His undoing.
overdose. It was a tragedy, but
Yeah,
off the field, he was a heck of a guy. He really was.
he was, but I wrote about him
It's
in
in
the
the
book.
book.
And as part of that, I drove down the street where he lost his life, which is even to this day, it's a terrifying street in Baltimore. And I drove through there, and I wanted to see the exact address where he had died. And it was just such a sad place. I mean, to think that he lost his life there, there's no doubt in my mind he belongs in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He should
Yes,
be
he
there.
does.
He should have been there in the first ballot. The only reason I'm sure he wasn't is because of the circumstances of his death, which were drug related. He died of a heroin overdose. So that was why he was not, I'm sure that had a lot to do with why he wasn't put in, but he should have been. I mean, if you really think about it, if he had gone into the Hall of Fame, that late 1950s Colts defensive line would have been considered maybe right among the greatest of all time, with Big Daddy, Art Donovan, and Gino Marchetti on it, along with Ordell Brazy was I think the other defensive end on
And they
that line,
also had Don Joyce at one point.
and Don Joyce. Yeah.
And
So
I'll
if they
never forget
that was an unbelievably good line.
the greatest line of its era. And I'll take it one step further. They were great characters too. Like Art Donovan's appearances on the Tonight Show were fantastic.
Yeah.
And
Very
he
funny.
talked about Bobby Lane being the drinker he was. I mean, every Saturday night, Bobby Lane used to go into the Hill District of Pittsburgh, the African American district. Now, one thing about Bobby is that he was a good guy. The coach, Buddy Parker, was basically an unregenerate bigot. He was a terrible bigot. But Bobby wasn't that way. But Bobby would play music every Saturday night with his trumpet at the Hurricane Bar. And one night he got so drunk that the next day he showed up. He was in a hotel. They had to get him out of bed. They said he's not going to be able to play today. So they take him to Pitt Stadium. They had to get him out of the car. They had to take him in. They were playing the Chicago Cardinals. That's how old we are. How old I am. The Cardinals had moved to St. Louis, I guess, by the time you were a baby.
Yeah,
But
true.
I went to. They played the Chicago Cardinals, and they had to carry Bobby out of the car into the locker room. They said he's never going to be able to play. He goes on the field. He had the greatest game of his career. He passed for over 400 yards. The only one that was ahead of him for yardage in one game at that time was Norman Van Brocklin, who was
Right.
also a tough
And
guy.
and still at the top of that list to this day.
To this day, no one ever exceeded that. But I want to go back in terms of the history, because you and I grew up as football fans, but there's something about your book that is remarkable. And that is, you recount vividly, better than any work I've ever read, how pro football in those days was a mom and pop game, my mom and pop operation. Today, for example, the Pittsburgh Steelers are worth over $1 billion.
Yeah.
In those days, you could go into the Fort Pitt Hotel in downtown Pittsburgh. I know Carol Rosenblum also he didn't run it so much as mom and pop. He was a little less down to earth than Art Rooney was. Art Rooney was a great guy, a great spokesman for the NFL. He was not his son Dan was much better at running the franchise. But, the Steelers their draft choices were terrible, and they lost John Unitas. He would have been the greatest hero. He's the subject of your book. He would have made the Steelers a winning team, and they cut him. That's how they did not know what the heck they were
Well, they
doing.
never even really tried him out. That was what made him so angry about it. Is he never got into he didn't play one play in a single preseason game. They never looked at him. They never used him in practice. I think the Rooney boys talked to their father, sent him a letter, told him how he was the only person that he threw to were them on the sidelines. He never, they didn't pay any attention to him, and then sent him packing, and he was furious about it for the rest of his life.
He absolutely was right to feel that way. But back then, it was such a mom and pop operation. I could go to downtown Pittsburgh as a child, and while my father was outside, I could go in and I could get tickets at the Fort Pitt Hotel or the Roosevelt Hotel in downtown Pittsburgh. Who would come out and schmooze with me basically while I was getting the tickets? And he didn't know who I was. Art Rooney. He had that kind of intimacy with the fans. Today, you try to get a Steeler ticket, you can't get it. The tickets are willed by people as part of their estates. The tickets cost a fortune. I remember people complaining about when the ticket price went up to $7 at Forbes Field. And the Steelers played in the two worst venues you could play in for football. Great venue for baseball, Forbes Field. But Pitt Stadium, you had to walk up Cardiac Hill, it was called. It was all benches. And Forbes Field, it was just not a good venue for football. And but nevertheless, there were memorable moments I had. But I was amazed at you, and I've been curious about this. You had to do some thorough research because you were born. I was born in 1949. You were born in 1965. How did you manage to capture the exact flavor of how pro football was a mom and pop at that time?
Well, it's the real answer to that is journalism. If you do your research and you read everything you can, you watch every piece of film that you can, and not only of football, but of the time period, of the way the buildings look, of the way people speak. Your job as the writer is to recreate that world on paper.
But
And
I don't know of any people my age who could have recreated it as well as you did. It
yeah.
was incredible. I'm saying, I remember the experiences of being, in those days, baseball was everything. Pro football was the sport, if you were interested, that you would watch in the off season. Okay, but baseball still was everywhere. Was the sport that people identified. It started changing a little bit in 1950 with the New York Giants when they became a leading team, and the Dodgers and Giants had moved out of New York. And in a lot of ways, the New York, football giants basically gave people an alternative because baseball had a certain unpopularity after the move. But the New York Giants, but then ultimately, that sudden death game, in my view, was the game that did it for pro football. That's when the various entrepreneurs saw what a great television sport pro football was. That's at least my view.
Well, that's where you really get to see what a great franchise the Colts were, because not only were they the winners of that game, which can still to this day rightly be called the most important game in pro football history, but
Absolutely.
they were also the participants in the second most important game in pro football history, where they were the losers to the New York Jets in Super Bowl III. And so those two games really kind of bookend the story that's in the book, but they also kind of bookend the decade that really created professional football with, what it became. I mean, the red hot intensity of the rivalries and the games. And I mean, you think about it, like people talk about Tom Brady, and you hear the kids today, he's the GOAT, he's the GOAT. Well, sure, he went to a lot of Super Bowls and he won a lot of Super Bowls. But imagine if he lived in a world where instead of playing the Jets and the Dolphins and the Bills, 6 times a year, he, like Johnny Unitas, he played Vince Lombardi twice a year. He played George Halas twice a year. He played
Absolutely.
George Allen twice a year, all for one playoff spot, to get into in the early part of the 60s, there was still only one postseason spot available in your division, and that was it. If you didn't make it, you didn't make it. In 1967, the Colts were undefeated going into the last game of the year, lost it to Los
I
Angeles,
remember
and then
very well.
didn't make the postseason. They had the best record in football, and they were undefeated until the very last game of the year, lost it, and then didn't make the postseason. That's how intense it was. That's how hard it was in those days. So it was that intensity, that live and die spirit of every single game. That's what created the game that America fell in love with.
Well, I not only emphatically concur for you, I'll take it one step further. The players today are bigger, stronger, better trained. Those players in those days were the toughest I've ever seen all these years.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, Chuck
Nineteen
Bednarik
Lane,
is a perfect example.
Bednarik, I mean, was there ever a cooler player in all of history than Chuck Bednarik? I mean, he was one cool player. He was a super, super tough guy. NFL films, talking about watching these films from the era, they show this one film of Bednarik's life, and they show him knocking on his mother's door. His mother still had the accent from the old world, and she says, I told him you never bully anybody, but if somebody starts with you, boom, you give it to him good, she said.
Well, that's what
I'm
he
sure he
did.
gave it to him good.
Yeah, that's what he did to a famous Colt assistant coach, Chuck Noll. When
Yes.
Chuck Noll was a guard for the Cleveland Browns, he once hit Bednarik for the side. I think Bednarik may have been knocked out, but Bednarik didn't get mad at him at the time. He got even. And the next time they were on the field, he hit him with a block, and he knocked Chuck Noll, who was one of the most underrated coach I've ever seen, by the way. He knocked Chuck Noll into the next world. And they were tough. I mean, Big Daddy, Art Donovan, Bill Pellington. That guy ate nails for breakfast, as far as I was concerned.
Oh yeah.
Unbelievable linebacker for the Colts.
Yeah. I mean, there were just unbelievably great players in that era. And I think that fans today mistakenly believe, oh, they were smaller, they were slower, they weren't trained as well, they weren't as athletic, all of these, crazy notions. But when you really look back at that 1960s football, those were you could look at so many positions and say, well, that guy was the greatest player who ever lived at that position, including Unitas, including Jim Brown, including Buckus. I mean, those guys, they've never been surpassed. I mean, maybe Ray Lewis is, he was faster than Buckus, obviously, was super fast. But I mean, nobody ever was better than Jim Brown. Nobody was ever better than Unitas. And I would
Absolutely.
say, Ray Lewis and Buckus would be about tied for greatness.
Well, no, you were 100% on the money on that because yeah, I remember one time Johnny Unitas, he had a broken nose and he got mud from the field just to stop the bleeding. You write about that in your
Yeah.
book. I mean, these guys were authentically tough. I'm glad they have concussion protocols today, but they didn't have any concussion
Well,
protocols.
let's go back to that story for a second because it really tells the Johnny Unitas story.
Sure.
I mean, they were playing the Bears. The Bears used to, like later became a big scandal to have a bounty out on a single player. Tom Matty said the Bears had a bounty on John Unitas every single game. So in this particular game, I
Wow.
don't know what year it was, 1960, I think, or 61, and they came in. Jim Parker couldn't handle Doug Atkins. Atkins came in there, clubbed Unitas in the face, broke his nose on the outside. Blood was gushing from the bridge of the nose. Blood was gushing from both nostrils. His lip was cut and bleeding at the same time. They couldn't stop it. So, as you correctly said, they went to cauterize the wound by shoving mud in both his nostrils. The referee wanted to eject him from the game. Unitas refused to leave. The mud and the blood is pouring into his mouth, out of his nose. Parker vomited on the field just looking at it. So what happened? There were like 20 seconds left in the game. And the next play, he fades back to pass with the mud and the blood still raining out of his face and hits Lenny Moore in this little tiny piece of 1 inch real estate in the back corner of the end zone and wins the game with that pass as the time ticks out. That was Unitas. That was the mystique. That's who he was.
And that's why he is the greatest quarterback of all time, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah,
They don't protect
I agree.
the officials don't protect They didn't protect quarterbacks in those days like they
No.
are protected today.
Well,
These
they,
guys,
what I said in the book is that in today the quarterback is the most protected man in the field. It's like he lives in a gated community, But in that day, the quarterback was the toughest man on the field. He was the most endangered man on the field. And while all this violence is swirling around him and is sure to get him on almost every single play that he fades back to pass, he's playing chess with the defenders in his head. Meanwhile, he's about to be, mugged and beat up at the same time that he has to be focusing on what he's seeing in front of him. I mean, of course, it was dangerous. It was these guys were literally losing their souls out there, but that's what made the game so intriguing and exciting.
well, let me tell you something. That kind of passage in your book, I couldn't put it down. When I would read a passage, the way you described every bit of it, and you did it with a coolness at the same time, I said, this is the greatest book on football I've ever read. He's giving us the total flavor of what the National Football League was at that time. And it was a tough game. The players were tough, but there was a certain ethic they had. They didn't complain. They just went out there every week risking their lives. But there are two things about your book that I think are largely ignored by other scribes who write about pro football. One was, but I'll get to the big central point about the Unitas relationship with Shula. Number one was the greatest rivalry in those days. People mistakenly think it was the Packers and the Colts because Packers and the Cowboys because of those 66 and 67 games. The greatest rivalry was between the Packers and the Colts because I went to law school at the University of Wisconsin. You have no idea, well, maybe you do, how much the Packer fans hated the Colts, hated them because there was a game before Lombardi came, and the Packers that day were beaten by the Colts. The Colts were making up for some slight from the year before. The Colts won this game 56-0. If you go to Green Bay today and meet some of my law school friends my age, they will still complain about that game. They hated the Colts because of that game.
Well, I think that rivalry and Lombardi really respected Johnny Unitas. I mean, I found example after example in newspapers of that era where Lombardi would just over and over again say that Unitas was the best football player he'd ever seen. I think that that respect for Johnny Unitas is what really created the Lombardi that everybody knows today. So, for instance, what is Lombardi most famous for? It's for the Green Bay sweep.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, and also just those simple dive plays with Jim Taylor, straight up the gut, and Paul Hornung coming around the end. That running game, that fanatic adherence to fundamentals that Lombardi preached like a Catholic, saint.
Well, that
Those
was his background
fundamentals,
too.
they were created, I'm convinced, because he wanted to have a great running game because he felt the only way to beat Johnny Unitas was to keep the ball out of his hands. When you run the ball well, you not only get yards, but the clock continues to tick, and it makes it's very frustrating for an offense, and especially a quarterback, when you can't even get your hand on the ball. And I think that was what was the brilliance of Lombardi that nobody ever really talks about, was that running game was really created, I think, as a response to Johnny Unitas. You can't beat you if he can't touch it. I think
Absolutely.
so that rivalry, to me, in all the history of the NFL, that was the greatest rivalry in the history of the game, were the Packers and the Colts of the 50s and 60s.
You were 100% correct. And every scribe I know overlooks that. And they also overlook something else. The Colts had the sudden death game that was, I can still remember my daddy and I sitting there when that one fan ran on the field and they had to chase him off. And that Alan the Horse Amici scoring that winning touchdown, Alan the Horse. And so I started calling myself Alan the Horse, even though I couldn't play worth a hoot. And then the Super Bowl game, which made the Super Bowl, by the way, because up to that point, the first two Super Bowls, no one took the American Football League seriously. And it was looked at almost like it was an exhibition game. And it was the Jet victory over the Colts that really did it for pro football, legitimized the AFL. But you point out something else. That game and when the Western Conference was tied before they had the complete, putting the merger into effect between 1965 between the Packers and the Colts. That was one of the greatest athletic contests I ever saw. That's when Zeke Bratkowski had to go in for Bart Starr, and it went into basically sudden death at the end of the game, as I recall. But there was another factor
Yes.
there that and people in Baltimore will complain about this, and they are right. Uh, there was a field goal that was kicked by Don Chandler. The hell that was a field goal. I mean, that it was so foggy that day. That field goal was wide right, and that's after that they made the goalpost, as you point out in the book. That was a significant development in football because they made the goalposts higher after that, and they really changed the game. But when that field goal was missed, and the Packers got credit for that, oh, that was a wound, and then unbelievable.
Well, what I said in the book, and I still believe it to be true, is that game was the high point of the NFL.
It
It never
was.
was as good again after that game, I think. It was an unbelievably exciting season. The Colts were out of it. Unitas got injured and broke his leg against the Bears again. 2 weeks later, his replacement, Gary Quazzo, he was injured by the Packers themselves in a game where the Packers murdered the Colts by I think Horning had 5 touchdowns that day, something like that. And that was in the fog of Memorial Stadium. And so somehow on the last day of the year, the Colts won the game. Tom Matte playing significant time at quarterback or running back. Um, and the Packers lost to the Rams. It was I think it was to the Rams. Unbelievable.
It was to the Rams.
It was either the Rams or maybe San Francisco. I
Oh,
can't
San
remember.
Francisco 49ers. Because
Yeah,
supposedly the Colt players they figured the season was over. And you wrote about this. They said
yeah,
all of a sudden Shula called him up and he said, get ready for next week.
yeah. What he said was, "Tell those sons of bitches to get their asses on the airplane and come back
I
home."
love that you said that.
They were all in Las Vegas fooling around,
Yeah,
because they thought it was
I love
over.
the way you put that and the way you wrote that. That's exactly what he said. But
Right.
that leads to one of the big themes. Your book covers. It's not just about Unitas and Shula, but that's a compelling story. But it also was about the whole transition from pro football, still being a tough game, a great game to watch if you were a fan, but to evolve into what was really the national sport. What made it the national sport in so many ways was that Super Bowl III in Miami on
Yeah.
January 12, 1969. But there was you write about Shula and Unitas, but you wrote something else. I'm a big Weeb Ewbank fan. I think he's the most underrated coach I've ever seen. He won 2 titles in a
Right.
row with the Colts. He won that first Super Bowl that the AFL ever won with the Jets. Is he in the Hall of Fame? I'm not sure of that. He
Yeah.
should
Oh,
be.
yeah. He was a first ballot Hall of Famer, I think. He went into the Hall of Fame, but yeah, you're right. I mean, but you never see him on the list of greatest coaches. But to me, I'd say he's the best coach in the history of football. I mean, he won the 3 titles, never lost one. He had a tied record in the regular season against Lombardi, and he won. The 68 Jets were a perfect replica of the 58 Colts. They were built
100%.
in the exact same image. Namath was basically identical to Unitas when you really think about it. Eubank taught them both to be self-sufficient on the field, to call their own plays, and they were both considered among the greatest play callers in football history. Namath was a great, great, great football player. He's
Yes.
wrongly remembered by people today. They look at statistics only and say that he was an overrated player. He was not an overrated player. He was damaged goods on day one that he came into the league. He was an incredibly great athlete, and he was an incredibly great pro football player. And Eubank, I mean, he took two teams from bankruptcy to make champions out of both of them. He found and developed two of the greatest quarterbacks in history. He was an unbelievably great coach.
100%. And you make a point of something here also, that Johnny Unitas really loved Weeb Ewbank. You
Yeah.
know, and I think what you just alluded to, Weeb Ewbank, I thought I was in reading your book, you talk about all the grievances that Johnny Unitas had, although he must have had one other very serious grievance that he never revealed. That's what I inferred from your reading. Like Jimmy Orr, he was once having a conversation with Jimmy Orr, and Jimmy Orr said, "Why do you hate him so much?" And he said, "Well, he lied to me." But I think a lot of it was based on the fact that Johnny U wanted to call the plays, greatest play caller I've ever seen. And he proved that with the Colts. And we Eubank gave him the shot in 58 and 59. But then when Don Shula came to the team, he wanted to be in total control. And Johnny Unitas not being able to call his own plays, it really took a lot away from him. And he had to resent that with everything in his being.
Well, I think he still called the plays, but there was a lot more, there was a much more of a heavy hand on what he could call, what he should
Exactly.
call in situations. As Charlie Winter, Weeb's son-in-law, and also the Colts defensive coordinator under both Weeb and Shula, he said to me, when Weeb was the coach, it was like this. He said, we would show him what we thought was right, all week. He had a list of the plays that we thought he should run in any given situation. And then on Sunday, it was his show. He called what he wanted, when he wanted. We might pull him aside and say, hey, have you thought about this or that? But it was up to him. He did everything. He said when Shula came, it was a totally different story. And it was a tug of war over that play calling. And that infuriated Unitas. And I think it infuriated Shula too. I mean, Shula saw himself as the head coach of the team, as Tom Matty put it, and Unitas saw himself as the head coach of the offense, and Shula is the head coach of the defense.
Well,
So
you know what? I am a sympathizer with the late great John Constantine Unitas on that for several reasons. Even Lombardi at Green Bay, who was a real martinet. I love Vince Lombardi. I love him because of the way he integrated the teams, and he at a time when African Americans were really being denigrated by pro football, and he stuck up for Lionel Aldridge's right, an African American, to marry a white member of the staff. Vince was colorblind. Vince was also very defensive of his brother, who was a gay American, and he had a wonderful heart, Vince. He was tough, but he had a wonderful heart. But he let Starr call his own plays. In fact, they used to say once the teams got on the field, he was there, but he wasn't trying to micromanage on the field. Now, that was something I held against Shula, but I also, although you'll disagree with him and you have far better knowledge than I have, but I had something else about Lombardi and Weeb Ewbank won the big games. Don Shula lost a lot of big games.
yeah.
He lost that game. He lost to Cleveland in '64, which I never knew all the goings on of that week. I read your book, that passage. I read over and over again because I remember the Browns. They shouldn't have been on the same field as the Colts, and they beat them 27-0. I
Well,
mean, it's
statistically,
unreal.
they had the worst defense in football that year, even though they were in the
Yes.
championship game. So the people, the Colts had statistically the best offense in football and the best defense in football, and really that was a bigger upset, I think, than the Jets beating the Colts. So that was a horrible upset. And after the game, the press came to Shula and asked him what happened, and he said, this was his answer. Well, we sure learned about their defense, didn't we? He said. Well, the New York Times writer who had asked him the question, he noted that it was a criticism of John Unitas.
It was.
It was just unthinkable that he would criticize John Unitas in that way at that at that particular juncture. And they asked another coach that it was anonymously what he thought, and he said no. He said Shula did a terrible job of preparing his team. He said, I'm very certain, although I don't know it for sure, I'm very certain that other coach that they spoke to was Lombardi. You know, he
I bet it was. I bet it was. And I'll tell you something. You you didn't write that in your book, but I got it on the show tonight. So there I go. But you know, in looking back at it, Shula lost the 65 playoff game to the Packers. He lost that last game of the season in 60. The week before, the Packers gave the Colts the chance because I remember that blocked punt. I think it was Donnie Anderson. His punt was blocked, and the Rams ended up beating the Packers in over at the Memorial Coliseum. Otherwise, they would have been a full game behind the Colts. Actually, I think 2 games behind the Colts, and the Colts would have gone to the playoffs with a great team that they had. But he lost the last game of the season, the Rams and the Colts in 1967. He lost the Super Bowl. He lost some big games in Miami, like that game when Miami played the Oakland Raiders. I
Mhm.
am not a big Shula fan. I think
Well,
he's a very
he
decent guy.
also lost the Super Bowl in Miami before he won it. So
That's
he
right.
lost a lot of big games and a lot of championship games. But let me just say this: I don't necessarily agree about not being a fan of Shula. I mean, I think unquestionably Shula is one of the greatest coaches in the history of football, and yeah, I mean he was a coach for 30 some odd years. His winning percentage is incredible. And to me, like all of the failures that he had to suffer through before he finally won the Super Bowl in 1972, it's a case study in perseverance. I mean, it must have been terribly embarrassing situation that he was in, and he had to suffer that. And then finally, when he did win it, he had that undefeated season, which was a singular accomplishment. Even Unitas respected that accomplishment. And then Shula went on to become the winningest coach in the history of football. So I prefer to see it that he outlasted failure as a positive part of who he was. I think he was a pretty damn good football coach. I mean, he had so many wonderful accomplishments. And think about it. I mean, he went from the days of he was coaching against Hallis, he was coaching against Lombardi, and when he was still coaching against Parcells, and those
Right.
guys. I mean, it was an incredible long period of time that he was a good and relevant coach.
Well, no, I agree with you that he was a great coach, particularly on the games won. But I think Unitas gets the shaft in terms of evaluations because football fans who evaluate quarterbacks by their statistics are missing the whole point.
Yeah,
I think the
I
most
agree.
important way of evaluating a quarterback is big game performance, which is why I thought Terry Bradshaw was very underrated. He won almost every big game he had to play in. And because he had sort of a hayseed accent, people thought he was dumb. He called all his own plays. He
Well,
really
I
got
mean,
shafted with that.
people have to stop thinking about statistics and look at players with their own 2 eyes. Anybody who saw Terry Bradshaw knew that was one dynamite football player. The criticisms of him are based on the early days of his career. It took him a long time to develop, but when he did, he was a really great player. I mean, he ran like a fullback. People talk about Josh Allen being, a big tough runner. I mean, he had nothing on Terry Bradshaw. Terry Bradshaw was, literally a fullback when he ran the ball, and he had a cannon for an arm. He was accurate, and he was a lot smarter out there than what people say he was. I agree with you. He was a good play caller, and not only was he a good play caller, but he could really execute and deliver. So he was really fantastic.
And he won 4 Super Bowls.
Right.
You
And
know,
never lost one.
he never lost one. And he just really gets the shaft in terms of evaluation of all time great quarterbacks. But John Unitas, look, later on, the Colts got Peyton Manning. He lost almost every big game he played in, except 2 Super Bowls
Right.
he won later. But John Unitas was a winner. But you bring out something else that, as I got to the end of the book, it really moved me. And that was the tragic ending of John Unitas. He had lost his family. I don't think the Golden Arm restaurant lasted that long. And he was a very solitary. You really bring out that it had to move you as you wrote these words.
Well, yeah, it did. I mean, I don't think it was easy to be him. He, he was this first kind of football player as rock star, and it was very hard on his marriage. He wasn't a faithful husband, and but I think he really regretted it in the end. He maintained an affection for his first wife that a lot of people don't really acknowledge. Um, but he maintained an affection for her his whole life. I think he on many levels regretted losing her. And I'd heard that from more than one person in a position to know. And I think he did poorly in business. The Golden Arm was somewhat of an exception to that. It was around a long time. In fact, I live right next to where it used to be. But he had a lot of business failures that were just embarrassing to him and crippling to him. A lot of family tensions between his two families. He had large families with both wives, and they were very much separated from each other. The two families, the siblings weren't really very well integrated with each other. So he didn't have an easy life. He brought a lot of problems on himself, but he seemed to be a generally good guy in almost every respect, except he had some bad failings as a husband and a father.
But he was a dominant figure in the rise and growth of the National Football League. What is so wonderful about your book, there's several dimensions. Number one is you want to read a book about the history and development of the NFL. And like Howard Cosell used to talk about, I was a big Howard Cosell fan.
Me too.
He used to talk sports affects the sociology of our very nation. Now we used to laugh when Howard said it, but he was right.
He was
Sports
right.
does affect the movement of franchises, which can really cripple and destroy. Brooklyn is doing better today, but for years it wasn't the same after the Dodgers left. And I know the blow that the Colts gave Baltimore when they took off. People identify with their sport teams, but you also you wrote something about that. You integrated the Vietnam War with what was going on in pro football. That was magnificent. That was an absolutely magnificent of interweaving you did. You wrote something else that I had read about before, and it brought back a chilling memory. You wrote about how when it was about the time Big Daddy had the overdose. You wrote about a prize fight, and Wayne Bethea was involved in it.
Hmm.
And when he killed the man in the ring, I remember Sports Illustrated writing about that fight because I'm a
Thank
boxing
you for
fan
joining
too.
us for the latest edition of
Everything was so
Dynamic Political
beautifully
Centrism.
interwoven and literate.
Check
In
back
your
each
book.
week for our newest
Nowadays, you
episodes,
get a
and you
book
can
on
catch
football.
past
Well, he hit him.
episodes
He knocked him down.
online
That's
via
not
YouTube
the
and
whole of the
Spotify,
game.
and please
The whole
subscribe
of
to
the
our
game
Substack.
is the interweaving with sociology, with the way life is, and no one duplicates. You and Roger Kahn are the only guys that, and there's a third. Pete Golenbach does that fairly well, but not as good as you and Roger. And
Well,
you
I
are
thought, what I noticed was that at the beginning of the decade of the 60s, the players were like most of us, they were somewhat at the mercy of the culture. Most of us, we wear the clothes that our contemporaries wear. We listen to the music that our contemporaries listen to. Everything about the culture kind of affects us. But by the end of that decade, these men were changing the culture. The culture wasn't
yes.
only affecting them, but they were changing the culture. As you're accurately saying, Jackie Robinson changed America. Muhammad Ali changed America. The stars of the NFL changed the country in certain ways. The whole thing about the Vietnam War that was interesting to me is that the Colts, losing to the Jets, it was almost a metaphor for America losing in Vietnam, and
Yes.
this idea that something that was huge and a crusher, and the Colts won the '58 championship game, and America won World War II. But when it came to the Super Bowl III, or Vietnam, where they faced a much weaker opponents, they both lost. So that's where I saw that football was a metaphor for that decade of war, and war was a metaphor for football as well. So that was very interesting to me. And
Well, you
so,
portrayed it perfectly.
yeah, well, I got lucky sometimes in there.
No, 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 that wasn't luck. No way. Don't give me that. I'll tell you what was great is you also portrayed the NFL as the establishment. The AFL was the insurgents. And I never
Yeah.
took the AFL seriously until Super Bowl III. It took that long, and it was one of the greatest moments in the history of football.
Well,
Let
I
me
thought
ask
it
you,
was balderdash that they weren't as good. It was just a marketing idea that they weren't as good. They were choosing from the same pool of players. They had great coaches, many of whom were, NFL coaches
Right.
previously. And I think that the only red herring in the whole deal were the Packers. The AFL found them as hard to beat as the NFL teams found them hard to beat. So, if you took the Packers out of the equation, the AFL and the NFL were more or less, equal. Although the AFL, when you take the Packers out of the equation, they were 2-0 against the NFL, not counting the Packers. So, I mean, I think they were roughly equal, two equal leagues.
Well, it was proven. What your contention was proven because Jets won in the 1969 Super Bowl. The next year, the Kansas City Chiefs defeated the Minnesota Vikings. They were big underdogs. Then the Baltimore Colts, who had gone to the AFC, defeated the
Yeah.
Dallas Cowboys.
Well, that
And
was very disappointing to Namath, and I think many of the people in the AFL was that first merger Super Bowl was between two NFL teams, and I think that was really stuck in the craw of those guys, and it did show, how strong the old NFL was. That in the first year of the merger, it became two NFL teams. But, the Colts really, as soon as Shula left, the Colts became dominant power again. They were under Shula, but as soon as he left, they went back to the championship game, went to the Super Bowl, and the next year went to the AFC title game where they lost to Shula. But, I think that both Shula and the Colts were better off after the separation, after the divorce.
I agree 100%. And there's so much legend about the Baltimore Colts, and it's a wonderful memory. I'll finalize this broadcast. This has been magnificent. I can't thank you enough for coming on and bringing the real history and essence of pro football to all our listeners. All right, I'm going to ask you to make a pick for the game on Sunday. I'm now a Philadelphia Eagles fan because my son, who grew up in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, converted me to the Eagles, and I would watch games with him on Sunday. I'm a fan of theirs, but I think I'm a jinx, whatever I predict. So I'm predicting Kansas City in the hopes that they'll lose and the Eagles will walk away with a Super Bowl trophy. What do you think?
I think the Eagles have been the best team in football all year. I think the Ravens actually had the best roster of players, but I think that the Eagles played as the best team all year. They handled the Ravens handily when they beat them. I don't think Kansas City is all that great. I think they get a lot of relief from the referees and things of that nature. Obviously, Mahomes is a very fine player, and obviously Andy Reid is a very knowledgeable coach. He's an excellent coach. But I think Philadelphia is a better team. I think they proved it all season long, and I think Philadelphia is going to win on Sunday.
I hope and pray. I'll go to Shul this Shabbos and I'll pray that Jack Gilden is right. But if the Eagles win, I'll predict one thing. It'll be
Yes.
Saquon Barkley, he could have played in the days you and I talked about. One of the
Alan,
greatest.
when you're praying on these things, throw in a little extra one in there and see if you can get me a few extra bucks too from the big guy. Ask him for that too.
Oh, I will for both of us. I mean, for both of us. But Saquon Barkley he is something else. He reminds me of. I don't care if people say, my son we have a great relationship. He's always saying, Dad, you're always talking about back in the day. Well, back in the day, the greatest all around offensive football player I saw was Lenny Moore because he could run and he could receive and he had to overcome a lot of bigotry. He's still alive. God bless him. And, I remember Lenny Moore. He was a classic. But Saquon Barkley reminds me of Lenny Moore. And that's as high
I
as
think he appears to be a little bit stouter than Lenny Moore to me, but he's a great football player. Obviously, he's proving that he's one of the best. And and Lenny Moore, for all the reasons that you just enumerated, he's probably one of the 10 greatest football players that ever lived. That's the most underrated football player I've ever seen. Most people have no idea how great Lenny Moore was.
I can't agree with you more. And I think that anyone who talks about pro football and proclaims himself a maven and expert and doesn't mention Lenny Moore on their top 10 players is a fraud. Lenny
Yeah.
Moore there was nothing like him.
Nothing like him. The only player that I could see in later years that was somewhat similar to him, at least in my opinion, was Marcus Allen.
That's a good comparison.
I
But
mean, especially as a running back, he was similar to him. I don't think he had the receiving skills that Lenny Moore had, but Marcus Allen was also a versatile player. He could block very well. He could get into that end zone like nobody's business. He was a great running back. But Lenny Moore was basically, he was Megatron, as a receiver, and he
like
was
Calvin
Gale
Johnson,
Sayers
yes.
as a runner.
Well, Jack, this has been a marvelous hour we've spent together, and it's been not just fun. When I talk about pro football, I'm not just talking about a great, exciting game. We're talking about American history. And in
Yeah.
your book, you have written not only as a sports scribe, you've written as an American historian. I hope you come out with another book. I know what a pain in the neck it is to write a book. Well, you have come out with other books. You wrote about Spectacular Bid. That
Yeah.
was a compelling story.
Was about corruption in horse racing, and I am working on a new book now, although I haven't had the progress with it that I would have liked just because of more pressing concrete needs. But I am working on one now, and it's about boxing.
Oh my God. You're talking to a person who is addicted to boxing books.
Well, you'll love this one. I mean, it was about a very big fight back in the early 1930s, but overlooked today. That's all I'll
Max
tell you.
Schmeling,
What's
Max
that?
Schmeling and Jack Sharkey. I'm trying to
I'll
guess.
tell you about it offline.
Tell me
But
about it offline because my grandparents, and my dad, I get emotional talking about my ancestors. They were neighbors of Billy Conn, the heavyweight champion of the world for 12 rounds on June 18, 1941. And he was trained by a guy named Harry Pitler, the brother of Jake Pitler, the coach on the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he went by the name of Johnny Ray. And Billy was trying to impress his fiancee, Mary Louise Smith. He didn't get along with his father-in-law, Greenfield Jimmy Smith, who was a customer of my grandparents' kosher butcher shop in Squirrel Hill. But, and they hated each other, and then they became close. He had a fight with Greenfield Jimmy Smith at the christening of his son. He hit him on top of his bald head and broke his hand, so he couldn't fight Lewis again until 1946. But Billy Conn, he was, and then he goes out in round 13. I'm going to knock him out. The hell with him. And he gets flattened like a pancake in 2 minutes and 58 seconds.
right, what did Lewis say? He could run, but he couldn't
He
hide.
couldn't hide. Yes, and
Alan,
Lewis,
and needless to say, I'm sure I don't need to ask you this question, but of course you read the great Frank DeFord piece about Billy Conn, didn't you?
I
The
knew
boxer
all
with the
that stuff
blonde.
before. I got mad reading that because I said, why couldn't I have written that? Because I knew all that stuff in the DeFord
Yeah.
article. I had
Well,
grown up in my family, like my grandfather came to this country. He was at the first game of the 1925 World Series the same day my father was born. He was watching Balder Johnson. This is what family lore. And he's at that first game. He made my grandmother manage the kosher meat market they had. And he gets home, and they were first cousins, my grandparents, which was common among Jews in Eastern Europe. He gets home. He goes to my great grandmother, my Bubby Bryan, and he said, "Where's Rose?" She says to him, "You have another son." That's where, you know. And so my dad was born that day, October 7th, 1925. And these memories are so much a part of the lives of real sports fans. And Jack, I can't wait for that boxing book to come out. And I will be one of the first purchasers. If I have to come down to Baltimore to get you to autograph it, I'll do that.
okay. Well,
Thanks so much,
let me
Jack.
tell you, Alan, I'm a big fan of yours. I love your writing, and I enjoy your point of view on all topics. I love your columns, so it would be my pleasure to see you in person sooner rather than later.
Well, Jack, I thank you so much for what has been a great night. I thank our producer, Dr. Jonathan Yaris, for making, he did double duty tonight. He was babysitting, and he also was taking care of this broadcast. So thank you so much, Yoni. And thank you, Jack. And I hope you're right about your Super Bowl pick. I will be joyous if the Eagles win.
Well, let me just say, too, I also want to thank Yoni and thank you, Alan, for having me on your show.
It's been a terrific evening.
My
All the
pleasure.
best. And to
Same
all
to
our
you.
fans out there, this shows how versatile this podcast can be. We had the greatest football scribe and the greatest historian, like Roger Kahn. He was both an American historian and a sports scribe. With Jack Gilden, you get the full package. Thank you so much, Jack, and
Thanks,
all the
Alan.
best to you and your family.
I look forward to talking to you soon and enjoy the Super Bowl.
I hope I will. Okay. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Have a good evening, and a good evening to all our fans out there, all the followers of this podcast. That concludes tonight's The Voice of Dynamic Political Centrism. Have a great Super Bowl day and a great week. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for the latest edition of Dynamic Political Centrism. Check back each week for our newest episodes, and you can catch past episodes online via YouTube and Spotify, and please subscribe to our Substack.